So what does the mindset of a successful negotiator look like? Well, firstly, for those of us who teach negotiation and train, we know that negotiation is not synonymous with compromise, and yet anytime you view negotiation out in the world, particularly in the media, it's always couched in those terms. Negotiation gets a bad name because people think, well, if I'm negotiating, I have to compromise on what's most important to me. And I don't want to do that, and I don't blame you. The problem is that negotiation is not about compromise. It's about creativity. It's about finding solutions to difficult problems. People who actually compromise when things get difficult are actually sort of being lazy. And so the reality is that the best negotiators, people who are really successful at this, know that negotiation is really about finding creative solutions to difficult problems. And I'll just give you a quick story. I met with a group of folks this morning, which was great, and had a nice time chatting with them. And I was telling them a little bit about a colleague at Harvard that I have, who was so convinced that most people compromised in negotiation when they shouldn't have, that he set up a business called Post-Settlement Settlement, which was the least sexy name he could think of. And he basically, what he did was he said to folks who reached agreement, come to me, and if I can help you make it better for both of you, you'll give me 10% of what we find. And he did 300 cases over a 7-year period, and in 90% of those cases, he found value that people left out there. And he attributed it mostly to the fact that people, when things got difficult, just compromised. Let's just split the difference and move on. So that's the first thing, is that negotiators, successful negotiators, know the difference, and they understand why compromise can be an efficient way of doing things. Secondly, best negotiators don't assume a win-lose scenario. And this has to do with your overall mindset and how you see negotiations. There's a great story of a Canadian shoe company that sent 2 representatives to Africa in the 70s to see what the market was all about. And one of the representatives came back and said, there's no market here, nobody wears shoes. And the other person came back and said, there's a huge market here, nobody wears shoes. So part of this is, how do you see what you're doing? I know a lot of people who are really uncomfortable with negotiation because they see it as a game of conquest. They see it as a win-lose endeavor. And I try to explain to them that it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, there's a lot of ways in which businesses that I work with are changing and saying, we can't negotiate that way. As most people tell me, our best new customers are our current ones. And if we don't negotiate in a way that is consistent with their values and our principles and what matters, if we don't treat them well in the negotiation process, we're going to lose. So people have really made a shift in the way that they see and approach negotiation. The third part of this is recognizing that information is the currency of negotiation. To me, the best negotiators are not the smoothest talkers. They are the people who listen the best, because you gather information when you listen well. Most of us are not very good listeners, despite the fact that we think we are. And so you can't get information if you don't ask good questions and you don't really listen well. And so people often say to me, well, when I'm stuck, what do I do? And I say, ask a question. Gather information. Find ways of understanding, because the other person on the other side of the table is standing between where you are and where you want to be. And unless you understand them, and unless you're persuasive, you can't get there. And the only way to get there is to understand what's important to them and fitting it with where you are. Okay? Again, another tenet of a successful mindset is being firm on the end goal. So in other words, don't compromise what's most important to you, but be flexible on how you get there. There are a lot of paths to finding a way forward. And too often people think there's one way, and that doesn't really help you very much. And so be firm. Know why, know what you're there for, what's most important to you, but be very flexible on all the different ways you can get there. There's usually multiple ways in which that can happen. Next point is, I have a colleague at Harvard named Roger Fisher who used to say, be willing to hang up the phone. In other words, be willing to send a signal to somebody that the way this is going is not okay, but don't cut the phone line. In other words, don't sever relationships, because when you do, it comes back to haunt you. And often relationships find a way of creating solutions when you least expect them. The next point is, again, as I mentioned, negotiation is about sort of the interconnected nature of a relationship, that you need the other negotiator to get where you want to go. And I think most negotiators understand that. And there's a story about this that, again, one of my friends told me that I think is worth sharing. And it's about two pilots who were flying during World War II, and they were training to go off to war. And they had gone up for 3 months and their routine was to go shut off an engine as if they had got it shot out and practice flying that way. And they had been getting pretty bored after 3 months of doing the same thing. It's not that exciting to do this over and over again. So one day the pilot looks at the co-pilot and says, you know, I wonder what would happen if we shut off the other engine and then tried to recover, because that could possibly happen. Co-pilot shrugged, I don't know. The pilot said, you know what, I'm going to do it. So he shuts off the first engine, then the second engine, and they're plummeting to Earth, and the pilot can't get the engine started. And the co-pilot looks at the pilot and says, boy, do you have a problem. Okay? And you'll hear that a lot in negotiation, where people will say, well, that's your problem. You deal with that, and when you've dealt with it, come back. No. If it's my problem, it's your problem, okay? Because you need me to go where you want to go as well. So understand that interconnected nature to things. Check assumptions and perceptions frequently. To me, assumptions and perceptions are sort of the silent challenges that exist in negotiation. We have a lot of these. We make them all the time, and we don't realize we're doing them. Okay, so, and when a problem comes up, you should be thinking, what assumptions am I making right now about the situation? It's so easy to do without really realizing we're doing it. And then finally, an effective negotiator knows that the mark of success in negotiation is not reaching agreement. It's about meeting your interest. I work with a lot of companies, and they tell sales forces and things, don't come back unless you've reached agreement. I've seen some of the worst agreements possible because they said, I'm not leaving, I have to come back with something. And I said, even if it's bad for the company, I'm judged on whether I reach agreement. So, of course, I will go back to leadership and say, are you sure that's what you want to be doing here? When you gauge success by meeting your interests, meeting your goals in a negotiation, it's a much better way of thinking about things, because people put a lot of pressure on themselves to reach an agreement, any agreement. And that's really not helpful. It doesn't get you where you want to go. Okay, so those are principles that exist when it comes to the mindset of a successful negotiator.